Applause, please, for our session partner, the Sunshine Coast Council. Okay. I'll accept that. They did cheer in the last session, but, maybe at the end. And I would like to introduce our first speaker, Kylie McFarlane, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the Insurance Council of Australia.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here at the ISC Connect conference for 2022. Firstly, I'd obviously like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and of course any of our First Nations representatives here today. There is no doubt that the last few years have been challenging for communities, for livelihoods and for businesses. Insurers are the nation's shock absorbers. Our industry is designed to insulate Australians from the financial impacts of loss and damage, paying out over $150 million in claims every working day. And like many of you, insurers have had their work cut out for them as Australians have lived through the compounding effects of COVID-19, devastating weather. In fact, over the last 18 months, we've had everything from bushfires, floods, cyclones, hail, earthquakes, unusually, and storms. Coupled with this current economic downturn, and as many of you would know, the critical shortages in labour, materials and supplies. From an economic perspective, we would call this a perfect storm. The ICA, if you don't know, is the representative body of the general insurance industry in Australia. Our members represent approximately 88% of gross written premium written by the private sector general insurers. So you probably know companies like Suncorp, IAG, QBE, Hollard and many others. Council members, both insurers and reinsurers, are a significant part of the Australian financial services system. As at December 2021, the Prudential Regulator statistics showed that the general insurance industry generates gross written premium of $59.2 billion per annum and has total assets of over $155 billion. We employ over 60,000 people, and as I mentioned before, we pay out over $150 million in claims every working day. Insurance Council members provide insurance products ranging from those usually purchased by individuals, so the things we would all buy, home and contents insurance, motor insurance, travel insurance, and those purchased by small business and larger organisations, such as product and public liability insurance, professional indemnity insurance, commercial property and directors and officers liability insurance. What's important to us is that the affordability and availability of insurance is a critical issue for Australia's economy. And while there is no one silver bullet to resolving this, a key lever is the critical improvement of risk and reducing that risk where possible. In the case of risk from worsening extreme weather, this means improved mitigation measures to better protect Australia and Australians. More broadly, the Insurance Council is tackling the climate change challenge by advocating for improved resilience in the built environment and better land use planning, building a national picture of climate risk and supporting programs that help communities to build back better after a disaster, something that many of you in this room would also support. As an industry on the front line of these impacts, we have an essential role to play in maintaining a resilient and insurable Australia. The Insurance Council will continue to invest in industry leadership, landmark reports, cross-sectoral partnerships and community engagement to tackle the critical and growing risks of climate change. To elaborate further on the impacts of extreme weather, the recent floods that hit Queensland and New South Wales earlier this year provide an important case study. This event is now the second costliest extreme weather event in Australia's history. The ICA keeps these records, and we recently announced that the losses from this single event are at a record-breaking $5.45 billion of insured losses, and this number is growing every month. Already, we've paid out $2.8 billion of claims and resolved approximately 54% of those claims. However, we had over 234,000 claims across business and households. But it's not just the insured losses that tell the story of the February-March 2022 floods. Extreme weather events such as this experienced in 2022 also cost governments, that is, us, the taxpayer, via payments from Commonwealth to states and territories, and payments by all governments directly to those who have been impacted. There is also the associated cost with the costs associated with goods that were uninsured or underinsured, which we estimate through work done by the McKell Institute to be some 46.5% of all home and contents, which is a significant number when you think about it. The McKell Institute calculates that this year's flood cost each Australian household, not just those affected, every Australian household, $525 through price impacts on agricultural goods, as well as additional government expenditure on recovery efforts funded through taxation. The McKell Institute calculates that the average Australian household paid $1,532 in direct costs in 21-22, and that's significant given the average over the last 10 years has been $888. And we need to forecast that out because by 2050, this will rise to $2,509 per household in direct costs caused from extreme weather, which will be calculated at over $35 billion per annum by 2050. Flooding, as one of the severe weather events that are probably most top of mind at the moment, is certainly on the front of our mind at the ICA and for our members. And I'm sure if you've seen the news today, Victoria is bracing itself for extreme rain over the next couple of days. Rain that will fall on sodden ground, which means flooding and flash flooding is apparent in those communities. Our focus on flooding over the last 18 months has seen us partner with James Cook University Cyclone Testing Station and Risk Frontiers to identify key risks affecting modern housing that built after the year 2000 during flooding. The research involved analysing thousands of flood claims for 4 recent flooding events. The report finds that the current land use planning settings in this country and associated building controls do not eliminate flood risk to modern properties. The current building code does not consider building resilience to flood risk, and there are key data gaps that prevent insurers, home and business owners from building an accurate picture of flood, particularly in a changing climate. In addition, currently in Australia, new developments can be constructed on a floodplain. However, there are some areas of the floodplain that just simply should not be developed. Because they are, the flow-on impacts occur to the community and to the environment. For at-risk communities already prone to flooding, there are some key considerations that need to be made around resilience investment, resilient infrastructure, and resilient land use and better building codes. This includes buyback schemes. Based on the analysis done by James Cook Uni and Risk Frontiers, a key recommendation of our report is that new developments consider the consequence and likelihood of the full range of possible flood events, including larger floods like the one we saw this year, as well as considering future climate projections expected over the lifetime of the building. Planned infrastructure is a key part of the solution. Whilst land use planning is the most effective way and the most effective tool to mitigate flood risk, as it can prevent the problem from happening at all, improving existing building codes will also be key. The Australian building codes and Australian standards must prioritise resilience as a principle underpinning the design standards for flood and any extreme weather event. Whilst our study focused on modern housing, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on where you live, much of Australia's flood-exposed housing stock was built prior to 2000. And this is where flood resilience measures will be critical. Flood measures the ICA is calling for include wet flood proofing of existing homes, investing in flood early warning systems like we see in Europe, and investment in critical infrastructure projects like flood levies and floodways. We know these measures work, and as an example, following the construction of the flood levy in Roma here in Queensland, insurance premiums dropped by an average of 34%. I want to provide some additional insight, some food for thought if you like, as leaders in the infrastructure sector, from our experience in preparing for, responding to and advocating for change in risk and disaster management. I'll frame these observations into 4 key insights. The first is exposure. We see many principles that I've discussed regarding avoidance as a primary lever, and mitigation and resilience measures where avoidance is not feasible as directly relevant to the infrastructure sector. In many cases, the scale of infrastructure dwarfs domestic and business assets. So exposure to hazards and how infrastructure might impact the risk or exposure profile of the surrounding communities and the environment is a vital consideration. The second is response. Services like water, telecommunications, roads and energy are critical as an extreme event is occurring and in the immediate aftermath. The success of the dissemination of emergency updates and information, lodging claims, connecting communities with families and evacuations rely heavily on enabling infrastructure being protected, resilient and having highly effective redundancy and support plans in place. During extreme events that have occurred during the past, during COVID-19, we have seen the efficacy of redundancy and support plans impacted by isolation and illness, for example. The third is recovery. We have often seen the persisting challenges with logistic networks following extreme events. This impacts local economies, but also the economy at large, where critical supply is disrupted. If anyone paid $15 for a cauliflower after the floods earlier this year, you'd understand how that really impacts on the economy. As mentioned earlier, the McKell Institute calculates that this year's flood cost each Australian household on average $525 through direct price impacts on agricultural goods alone. Again, effective resilience and planning are critical to protecting these vital lifelines. An important example in the recent memory is the flooding in remote South Australia, which cut critical supply lines for the eastern states and the Northern Territory. The final is future. The infrastructure that supports our nation must plan for, support and adapt to climate and hazard risk adapted communities. Actions of the sea, for example, alone will require $30 billion of investment before 2050, and the majority of that investment will be in nature-based and other infrastructure requirements. And alternatively, the infrastructure requirements to support a national scale transition to electric vehicles will be vital over the next decade. As we can see from our recent experience, factors like changing climate, decisions made or quite frankly not made, and actions taken or not taken at all levels of government, business and industry and within the community, and black swan events like COVID-19 can aggregate and entangle to create new exposures and devastating consequences. We welcome the federal government taking steps to ensure $200 million is available annually to invest in resilience, mitigation and prevention, with the introduction of the Disaster Ready Fund build. The establishment of NEMA and the Disaster Ready Fund are vital, necessary next steps to prioritising resilient and mitigated investment and infrastructure in this country. Another foundational requirement is robust and comprehensive national climate and hazard data that is accessible by all of us, industry, homeowners and government alike. Funding, coordination across all levels of government and industry, and robust and available data and insights, and enabled improvement and standardisation of our collective understanding of climate and hazard risk is critically important. The recent release of the CSIRO Global Megatrends report was another reminder that we are facing into considerable headwinds when it comes to tackling climate risk and ensuring that insurance remains affordable and available for Australian communities, particularly those vulnerable to extreme weather events. This once-in-a-decade report has found that the cost of extreme weather events is expected to triple over the next 30 years as climate change worsens. That all sounds very doom and gloom. However, in spite of all this, I do have reason for optimism. We've seen government and industries like ours collaborate successfully before and to reduce the risk present in our communities and our economy through solid investment decisions. And I'm quite sure we can do that again. Some of our best ideas and strongest collaborations are built under pressure, and I look forward to seeing what we do over the next decade as shared industries and with our governments to protect, mitigate and build resilient and insurable Australia. Thank you.
I don't actually think I've ever seen a room of people so spellbound by a presentation on insurance. Thank you very much. I think they were also just a tiny bit intimidated because they didn't ask a single question, and there must have been hundreds they really wanted to. So what we might do, in the interest of getting through the session on time, is I'll actually let each of the speakers run through their presentations whilst you guys frame up those questions, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. Does that sound like a reasonable idea? Excellent. In that case, why don't I introduce our next guest speaker, who's Tanya Smith, the Director of Sustainable Finance from the ANZ.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. As you just heard from Kylie about the insurance sector and its role in promoting resilient infrastructure, I'm here today to talk to you about the broader financial sector and give you a highlight and an update of some of the initiatives that are taking place in the broader financial services sector to encourage resilience and the role that infrastructure professionals can play to assist and feed into that. So historically, the financial services sector hasn't always thought about climate change as it does now. It used to think of climate change and climate change risks as a line in a financial model or the realm of technical professionals, and it thought about insurance as a way to deal with that, and that was sort of the extent of what most bankers or super funds gave the topic of climate change. However, we're seeing that perspective has changed significantly, and particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, financial institutions are really thinking differently about climate change risks, and that's largely as they've started to experience the magnitude of the financial risks that come about when climate change risks haven't been appropriately managed, and we bear the brunt of those impacts resulting from climate change. So now that we're seeing those sort of physical risks, whether they be acute or chronic in terms of floods and bushfires, really manifesting for the financial services sector as financial risks, the financial sector has really rallied and are mobilising to now address this and try to build more resilience into the system. I'm going to update you on 4 initiatives that the financial services sector are involved in at the moment, and talk about how you can potentially add value to those or loop in with those. And I'm also going to talk about what I think is the crux of the role of infrastructure professionals. At ANZ, like many of the leading financial institutions globally, we have really started embedding the language of climate change into the work that we do on a regular basis. So our organisational purpose is focused on shaping a world where individuals and communities thrive. And as part of that, environmental sustainability has been identified as one of our 3 core ESG priority areas. As part of that strategy, I sit within the sustainable finance part of the bank, and our role is to work with customers who are at the forefront of maximising the opportunities of transitioning to a lower carbon economy. But there's lots of ways that the bank and the financial sector are also looking at managing the risks from climate change. I wanted to start, before I launch into the initiatives that are taking place in the financial services sector, I wanted to just touch on what I think is the crux of the role of infrastructure professionals in helping facilitate resilience, particularly in relation to financial systems and that flow through in a systems effect, and that is in the role as a translator. Engineers, designers, infrastructure professionals are used to talking in terms of physical risks, in terms of probabilities of events, bushfires, floods, 1 in 100 year, things like that. Those, as I said at the start, aren't ways that the financial sector usually think. They talk about financial risks, and specifically 4 of the key ones that they often will be used to discussing are credit risk, market risk, operational risks and liquidity risks. And I see the role as for infrastructure professionals as translators, as people who can bridge that gap between what the engineers are saying and what the banks need to hear to make those investment decisions, or investors. So if we look at what the financial services sector is currently doing to try and mobilise action and address issues of resilience, the first thing that I wanted to talk about is APRA's Climate Vulnerability Assessment. So APRA is the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority. It regulates the financial services sector in Australia. So that's banks, super funds, insurers, investment managers. And in 2021, APRA required 5 of Australia's largest banks to undertake climate vulnerability assessments so that those banks could understand the material risks within their portfolio and the material exposures that they face in facing a future where climate change is already to a certain degree locked in. So the CVA process required banks to undertake scenario analysis and look at both physical and transition risks across Australian mortgage portfolios, the banks lending to the agricultural sector and lending to other businesses. And the process actually required them to identify counterparty assessments for 25 of their largest customers each and understand what risks those customers were facing from climate change in terms of their business models or their revenue or their cash flows, and look at what that meant in terms of the bank's own vulnerability. If that's the 25 largest customers and all of those things go wrong at once, what does that mean for the bank? So it's pretty interesting stuff. The results from that first CVA that's been required are yet to be released by APRA. They're releasing that later this year, but there has been a lot of market commentary about the process so far, and I guess one of the key takeaways thus far has been that there was a real issue with availability and quality of data. And so that's where I see the role of people in engineering, design and infrastructure coming in to help the financial services sector. You're used to understanding very intricate levels of data around different climate risks, and being able to help translate that and share that with the financial services sector will allow them to better understand their exposures and their financial risks and manage those so that the economy can continue to operate even in times of shock for all of us. The second initiative that I really wanted to focus on today and bring to your attention is the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And that's something that all of Australia's major banks have signed up to. It is an industry-led, UN-convened group of global banks who have essentially made the commitment to align their investment and lending policies with a net zero emissions future by 2050. So, as I said, all of Australia's major banks, and actually globally around 40% of banking assets throughout the world, those institutions have signed up to a net zero future. What that means in reality is that all of those banks will be having to analyse, measure, disclose and set targets to reduce their emissions over time. They are required to set intermediate, so 2030 targets, as well as the net zero 2050 target. And they're also required to set those targets based on science, so they can't just pick random trajectories. What does that mean for infrastructure professionals and the broader financial services sector is that banks are going to start making decisions much more heavily focused around the emissions intensity of the customers that they support. And so again, you as infrastructure professionals who are used to measuring or reading about emissions profiles and calculating those and communicating those in a really digestible way can help translate that, share that information with the financial services sector and help translate that so that banks can manage that transition in a responsible way. I also think we're likely to see an increase in demand for projects and companies that also have net zero targets, and so there'll be that issue of access to capital that if you can communicate that your project is aligned with those sorts of targets, there's a potential that you might have greater access to capital than other projects that can't. In terms of a third initiative that you should be aware of, that's the ASFI taxonomy project. So ASFI is the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute. It's a member-based organisation that's committed to helping the Australian financial sector realign to a more sustainable and resilient system in the future and to try and direct capital into green and sustainable investment options. They've convened a group of technical experts, around 50 from across Australia, to help develop an Australian-specific taxonomy similar to the EU taxonomy. So for those of you who aren't familiar, in the financial sector, the use of taxonomies has been sort of popularised to set a common definition of sustainable economic activity so that financial institutions can create credible and transparent investment vehicles that will allow for greater comparability in the future. So your role in terms of infrastructure professionals, particularly those of you who are undertaking IS ratings, you'll know that your projects or the companies that you're working with are likely to be at the forefront of green projects or the forefront of resilient projects, and you can use that information to communicate with the financial sector and classify that and show its alignment with that taxonomy once it is developed. And again, that may allow for greater access to capital or enhanced investment in those projects. The fourth initiative that I wanted to bring to the front of your mind, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this, is the role that the TCFD and TNFD are playing in the financial services sector. So for anyone who isn't familiar, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure is TCFD, and Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure is TNFD. Pretty sure they're talking a lot about TNFD in the other room right now. Again, the financial services sector are starting to rely on these disclosure frameworks in how they engage with their customers and are looking to projects and companies that disclose in alignment with those frameworks to help prioritise their investment and educate themselves about the risks and opportunities. I think that the TNFD is a really important thing for people in the infrastructure sector to be on top of and aware of, because as someone who used to work regularly on infrastructure projects, I remember seeing all these fantastic ideas like green roofs on transport hubs and really cool water treatment processes through urban sensitive design being value engineered out when it came to the project sort of financial analysis because they were seen as novel and nice to haves but didn't necessarily add value. I think what you're going to find is with increased focus on TCFD and TNFD by the financial services sector, you're going to be able to use those as front and centre examples of genuine value that you are adding as the financial sector starts to better factor in the value of biodiversity, for instance. So again, just to summarise, Those are just 4 of the initiatives. There are many more that the financial services sector are engaging in, and I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of interest in collaborating with other sectors to upskill and find solutions for the problems that the financial sector are facing. I would encourage all of you, as I said, as translators or as collaborators, to share the knowledge that you have with those people in the financial services sector to make sure that the business case for your projects talks to some of the language that financial services sector participants are used to using. And I would encourage you very much to talk about resilience and the value that your projects or companies are adding to that as, yes, the financial services sector are finally listening.
I am getting so much good material. I'll be going back to my office and everyone will know I've been to a great conference because I'll have all these new terms that I can blind them with. Like, oh, I'm so sorry you don't have your TFND ready. And they'll be like, I don't know what that is. That was very cool. Thank you very much. I really felt I learned a lot from you. And it's my great pleasure now to introduce the third of our speakers. Ordinarily, I'd feel worried for the one who had to go after the 2 of you. But I'm not worried about Emma at all because she's a tremendous presenter. So it's my great pleasure to introduce from our sponsor organisation, the Sunshine Coast Regional Council, its Chief Executive, Emma Thomas.
All right, this is the tough gig after lunch. We've got to sort of pick up some energy in this room here. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm standing on Cubby Cubby land and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And I'll also talk a little bit about how we're engaging with our cultural traditional owners to look at some of our practices as we face some of the climate change impacts that are heading towards us. I put some slides, well, I didn't put some slides together. Lovely Jill, who's down the back there, put some slides together. Thanks, Jill. It's always good to have something to look at while someone's talking at you after lunch. I think we all agree, and we've all heard from the previous 2 speakers, and no doubt from all your speakers, that the challenges that we're facing are probably the most complex for a range of different reasons, no more than the uncertainty and unpredictability that the current system provides. Because it presents itself in that way, as human beings, we've been so used to, particularly governments, being well practiced and well planned and really being able to tell people in advance what's going on to them. And even now, when we see ourselves faced with a recent announcement by the Queensland government only in the last 24 hours that we're going to have multiple cyclones hitting us early, people are very critical of this and they're saying, why didn't you tell us earlier? And the poor meteorologists just can barely keep up with what's going on in the pace of change. But our Sunshine Coast is a really beautiful place, and one where people really do value livability, they value the environment, they value all the natural things that are occurring. As a region, though, we're highly susceptible to the impacts of climate change, and we're already seeing some of those impacts. We're seeing the unpredictability of weather, the extensive floods that we saw earlier this year. We've seen drought in the past and we'll no doubt see drought again. We've seen bushfires and we'll no doubt see them again. So as a region, we've got our eye very firmly on what the things are in front of us and how we have to manage that as a region. The IPCC that most people had a bit of a short, sharp intake of breath earlier this year as it came out, which announced a number of things which didn't really necessarily surprise those of you who have been watching this for a while, but understanding that climate change risks are actually increasing, that the next 10 years is what everyone is terming the decade of action. And even if we are aiming for 2040 or 2050 as a net zero emission, we actually need to get into it this decade to make that count. If we don't do things this decade, then it really doesn't matter about 40 and 50 because we'll be too slow off the mark. So we've really got to get that going. And then significantly for this forum, the report actually went into raised a new climate risk, which was the ability or inability of institutions and governance systems to proactively respond, adapt adequately. That is significant. If that's been listed as a risk, then that's on all of us who work across this industry to really think about how we collaborate and bring ourselves to this problem together. So in terms of the Sunshine Coast Council, we've been very fortunate to be part of a government who believes in the notion of climate change and as a government and our elected officials support us to really have a strong, long strategic view about what's going on. We've been active in this space for about 10 years. Back in 2014, as we raised our new planning scheme, we put in for a 0.8 metre sea level rise at that time. And that's really significant because when we saw our flooding happen earlier this year, our new estates that had been built to that standard and had been just come out of the ground post-2014 have really been quite resilient and really didn't see any of the impacts of flooding that were going on around other parts of our region. Since 2017, our approach has been framed by a really fantastic document, our Environment and Livability Strategy. It won a Banksia Award last year. I think it was last year. It's all been a bit of a blur the last couple of years. But last year, because of the work that's been put into that to really look at the different parts of our region, the very strong long-term planning approach that we're taking, and making sure that we really do pay attention to how we do built infrastructure within our environment. So it doesn't just look at environment on its own, but really thinks about people in the environment. And also encourages both actions within the council to take on that low carbon emission approach, and also actions outside the council to encourage the community with that. The latest report from IPCC hasn't changed our approach, but it's probably focused us a lot more on how to integrate our services and functions together and also collaborate more with the regions around us. Council, in late 2021, acknowledged that and formally recognised that we were in a state of climate emergency. And that has been, again, another boost towards our actions around climate change in making sure that we have the governance structures in place, the measurements and the activities that can really keep us strong as we start to face into the next 10 years. One of the big outcomes of recognising a climate emergency was really putting a big big fire under us for getting activity and action towards our net zero emissions plan by 2041. We've only just put this through council in the last little while, and it provides us that coordinated and integrated approach across council to cover all the different types of emissions, the 1, 2 and 3 scope emissions, to look at the types of targets that we need across council. Our largest source of carbon emissions within our own organisation come from landfill emissions. That is about 76% of our emissions. And so when you think about us continuing to put things in waste and send that to somewhere that's creating emissions, that's fairly significant. And so we are very focused on, we've just gone to a compulsory green bin system to make sure we're separating out our green waste. That is our first step towards community education to help the community understand how to further separate things so we can move towards food and organic waste separation further on into the future. We have to apply circular economy principles. We have to reduce our landfill. The old adage of reduce, reuse, recycle. Recycle is at the end of that. And at the moment, we keep providing people with all these abilities and thinking recycling is good and it's fantastic. But actually, in the scheme of things, recycling is the last thing we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be reducing at the front end. And so the work that ISCA is doing is really substantial in respect to that, because a lot of the thinking that goes into just reducing the use of resources up front saves us the very large landfill that goes into our landfill at the moment due to construction. So if I go to the next slide. Climate risk management is something, it is a team sport, climate risk management. It's not something we should be all trying to do on our own. But Council has been putting in some fairly substantial initiatives, first of which was our climate hazard adaptation strategy, which was just put through Council last year. It is an 80-year strategy. It looks out to 2100 at what the sea level rise will be, You know, when we talk about long-term strategic planning, this is the type of activity we have to undertake to truly understand what we're planning for. It looks into the activities such as erosion of our beaches, erosion of our landscape, short-term and long-term inundation of seawater, so that we can really start to prepare our own council infrastructure programs and help our residents also understand what they need to do to become more resilient to the sea level rises that we expect. On top of that, we started a collaborative endeavour with Noosa Council this year. We like to say that climate change doesn't recognise the local government boundaries or borders along the way. It doesn't know that we're different. And so we went to town with Noosa, and we had a really good conversation to start our climate risk action roadmap. And in doing that, we combined our political levels, so the councillors who were responsible for looking at environment were actively participating. We surveyed our communities to understand the different views that community held around climate risk, and we surveyed our own staff extensively, which they loved a lot, didn't they, Jill? But we did do extensive surveys, and the whole purpose behind that was to put our roadmap together about how we face into climate risk. And you know, I remember being part of some of the activities we did around this, where leaders across the organisation really grouped into teams, and after some extensive discussions about what the risks we might see as a result of climate change, started to think about what this meant for the future of our organisation and how we might face into climate change as it starts to occur with us. And I think the big learning out of that was taking a broader view than just it always being about infrastructure. There are a lot of different things that we need to be facing up to, the working patterns that we have, and you know, just even the way that we're living and building in houses, and what our hours of school are. There's a whole range of impacts that we're going to have to consider and think about as a community as we go forward. We are doing some pretty cool stuff, I've got to say. Part of it is, you know, some of them have been unique projects that we've commenced, but more and more we're seeing these projects come together in collaborative forms. I think one of the biggest investments that we make as a council is in our flood modelling. We spend a lot of money on it. We are very ambitious in trying to get that flood modelling scenario right. I think it's an activity now, looking at the work that QRA, the Queensland Recovery Authority, is doing, is trying to combine the efforts of people in that flood modelling so that we can all put together our resources and make sure that this is the best that we can do. And when I think about the other industries behind me, the insurance industry spends a lot of money on flood modelling. Like safety, there's no gain in us all hiding this information and keeping it to ourselves. This is the information we should be sharing broadly across our communities so that we can put our resources to getting the best data, the best predictive modelling, predictive analytics together so that we can prepare ourselves for what's going on. Because if you think about what I said at the moment, the uncertainty and where we don't really know what's going on all the time, and it's very unpredictable, if we can get these models predicting and taking in information and giving us better predictive analytics, we'll be better prepared for that future. In terms of bushfire resilience, there's a lot of technology coming to bear, a lot of predictive analytics again that starts to map fire fronts and understand where they're going and help firefighters put fire out in the right places. One of the big activities that we undertook post our bushfires that happened, well, seems like a long time ago now, but it was only a couple of years ago. We have been working with our First Nations people in the Sunshine Coast to look at cultural fire prevention practices and cultural burning, and that has certainly taught everyone a lot, and we will continue to undertake that activity to learn the practices that have been in place over 60,000 years to try and really reduce the risk of fire as we go forward. And finally, our Blue Heart project. If people haven't seen it or heard about it, I encourage you to go on and have a look. Our Blue Heart is part of the Maroochy River floodplain. It just happens to be in the shape of a heart. But as the floodplain has operated for many years, it kind of got closed off for a while, and we've been allowing that floodplain to come back, and we have acquired land along with Unity Water and the state government and compiled land together. There are also a bunch of private landowners within that area. What we have seen is that we're re-establishing some of the natural estuarine environment. We've got bird life coming back and a whole range of other things. Oh, we've gone on to another slide. Come back. So we are really seeing the benefits of that. And when we had the significant rain event earlier this year, that Blue Heart floodplain worked beautifully. It did exactly what it was supposed to do, and it gives us that flood storage that has been there in actual fact for a long time, but built environment had started to constrain the floodplain. We had cane farms and a whole range of other things in there, and so as we start to allow that floodplain to restore and protect it and make sure we don't have any built form development in there, we're seeing a real return to the natural elements and return to the natural ability for the area to be resilient to floods. The other benefit that we have from the Blue Heart project is a carbon sequestration experiment. We are looking at the ability of that saline water environment to sequester carbon, which we believe is at a much higher rate than green carbon sequestration. So when we talk to people who have existing farms, mostly with sugarcane, which is no longer a sustainable product on the Sunshine Coast, the opportunity is there to look at the economic benefits of turning their minds to blue carbon farming. And that is a significant shift in the way that we consider farming and the way that we can consider our future credits across our region, which is fantastic. Finally, we have our new biosphere, our newly minted biosphere. We achieved our UNESCO biosphere rating in July of this year. It was the result of about 7 years of very hard work from our team, the Mayor and others. We've had a community reference group heavily engaged. Our focus has been on the Sustainability Development Goals, which are all sitting in front of you at tables today, but really focusing on people and the environment and how we all live and how we can have that sustainable livability into the future. It's not one at the expense of other, but really coming into harmony. It's been very popularly received from our community. Our community's been very engaged in the process. And now in Queensland, we have the unique experience where we have 3 UNESCO biospheres all end-to-end along the coast. So Noosa is a biosphere and Great Sandy Biosphere north of Noosa. So having those 3 biospheres together is a very exciting prospect as to what we can create and do within those biospheres. And when things like provenance become such an important thing about the fish we eat, the meat we eat, the food we consume, the way things are manufactured and grown and done, the biospheres certification gives us a really unique ability to be able to talk about how those things are done within our region. So finally, our team has learned a lot. They've been very focused for a long time, but I think the thing we recognise now and that everybody is starting to recognise is that this is a team sport, it's not an individual pursuit. And we need to work together stronger than ever to make a difference. We need to do it now because now is the decade of action. And we don't have time to wait for systems or people to sort of discover things more slowly because we've actually got to run pretty hard at this now. We've got to be able to understand multiple climate hazards at once and not just focus on one thing at a time. And we need to be able to improve our understanding, improve our systems so that they can help us with the predictive analytics, the predictive nature of where we're going, so that we can remain very focused on the problem at hand. One level of government can't do it. People often reflect down to local government and say, you're closest to the people, you must be able to do it. But in the end, we actually need to put risk where it's best managed, and we need to do that together. And Kate's going to ask us some questions now around that. Thank you.
Rightio, there's some complexity to this. Every time you saw someone's head dive down, it was because they were sending in a question, and there are a lot. So I'm going to give us 10 minutes for questions because we started 5 minutes late, so you can hold on for your next food break for an extra 5 minutes. Let's go to... well, actually, we should thank, first of all, Nicole Neal, because she was the first person to ask a question, and it was such a relief to me that I wasn't going to have to come up with the questions myself. And it's a great question too. So her question is, Tanya, what are the key vehicles for sustainability professionals to be those translators across to the financial services sector? Can you repeat the question? Would you like to read the question?
I would love to read
there you go.
questions, and you can work out how this works.
Oh no.
Which one is it?
Mr. Salman?
The key vehicles.
Yes. Are we good now? Awesome. There you go.
Thank you, Nicole, for the question. I think that there are a few different vehicles. I think that the hardest thing to do when you're an infrastructure professional is to actually find opportunities to connect with people in the financial services sector. If you think about conferences like this, I know we're probably the only bank here, but there are a number of conferences that insurers go to, that the banks go to, and so I think that conferences is one of those vehicles. I know that ASFI, which I spoke about, the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative, has leveraged a lot of professionals from different organisations across the sort of infrastructure space. So engagement with ASFI is one, and they've got a conference coming up in Sydney in, I think, a fortnight's time. The CMI, Carbon Market Institute, is another organisation, along with the Infrastructure Sustainability Council. I think those are the three that we, as a financial institution, or my part of the bank, which is institutional, tend to focus on. So conferences is one. I think online debate is another opportunity. There's lots of discussions and forums on things like LinkedIn that you can comment on and start networking that way and engage with those people. I'm going to shamelessly plug, I'm also part of a voluntary network called Women in Sustainable Finance, and it's not limited to just women, but we talk about issues that, women might find interesting in sustainability, but just general. There's a network for that group in each of Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, and so going along to those sorts of things and just talking to them and help them make that translation and help them understand how those risks translate into financial implications, I think is always valuable. So yeah, I'd focus on sort of some of the conferences and events and networking opportunities.
What I heard there was take Tanya out for a cup of coffee and she'll plug you into all of her networks. And just by way of an aside, you are quite the happiest presenter of the entire conference. You smiled the entire 15 minutes, which was such a pleasure. You could pass the microphone one along, because the next question was really about EVs, and you spoke about the importance of transitioning to EVs and what the implication was from an insurance perspective of that.
Yeah, it looks such an important topic, and I think the debate around EVs is really only just starting with the federal government, and we need their incentivisation to transition to electric vehicles. We've seen it successfully happen abroad. Norway is now 95% EV due to the incentivisation of that government there. But we have a very different challenge, and there are a couple. The first is land mass. And the fact that we actually have to figure out a way to put superchargers in across all of our main arterial networks across this country. And you take the M1, for example. My family's in the Hunter Valley. I live in Brisbane. We bought a hybrid because my EV is going to struggle to get from Brisbane to Singleton and have to stop every 3 or 4 hours to charge. So we do need to, one, figure out how to build the infrastructure around charging. The second is we actually have to figure out how we're going to retrofit existing buildings to actually have capacity from electrical surge. And that's a really big issue that's being discussed politically at the moment at federal levels and certainly across the building industry and the insurance industry. Particularly current strata buildings are not fit for purpose. And there was an article in one of the Sydney papers the other day about the fact that if you walk through Mosman now you trip over everybody's charging cables out on the footpath. Actually, a lot of housing stock isn't built for purpose either. That can create massive fire risk. So incentivisation, infrastructure, and then retrofitting and resilience in the building codes to manage the uptake of EV and what comes with that are going to be fundamentally important. Obviously, the fourth one is greening the grid, so that as you're using your EV, you're actually sourcing green energy in the first place.
I can now imagine, just a bit fancifully, that Kylie and Emma will spend the rest of the day with this massive smile plastered all over their faces because I've given you paranoia. Didn't intend to. You're also very happy. The next question isn't really so much a question, it's just a kind of rumination, really, that when you were thinking about your Blue Heart, I'm wondering the extent to which you were able to take, even conceptually, the non-existent data set, the predictive modelling set you'd love to have. Is there a way that we could have gone back and said, you know what, we know that we can reduce the insurance risk because we've got this absorptive capacity and we're going to borrow green funding to do this, and it's almost like a value capture thing by the removal of that insurance risk and the consequential economic loss. How clever were you in funding that?
Oh, well, I mean, that's a whole range of different questions, and I don't know about the beginning of the Blue Heart and whether that was a consideration. But ultimately, that's what we are attempting to do. I was thinking about the translation conversation and whether we've translated the work we're doing well enough with insurance companies, because we have been quite resilient in some of the past significant rain events here. And when you look at the different insurances that people are getting given, they have a real range on them depending on each insurance company's own risk model and risk appetite and what they're trying to do. So, I do wonder that we're translating that well enough. At the moment, we're kind of in experimentation mode. We've got a grant from the federal government to look at the carbon pricing within that blue carbon environment. So we'll continue to carry that out. But I think the opportunity is there for the future, not only on our own land, but for others to really change the economic model and see if we can invent a new economy that's based around climate credits and carbon credits.
So last question, which goes back to you, if you don't mind, and it's about the taxonomy question. Clearly inspired a lot of thought. Do we really need another taxonomy? Why do we need an Australian one?
Yes, so we potentially don't. I mean, many of the taxonomies that exist, we use in my role a lot, the CBI, Climate Bonds Initiative taxonomy, and obviously the EU taxonomy is massive. I think as like everything in the Australian sphere, the issue around what counts as sustainable and or green has had a lot of political debate, and as a result there's a real, I guess, misunderstanding between what the science says, what is good for the economy, and the idea behind, I think, ASFI and what they're trying to do is make sure that in the Australian context, given our unique assets and strengths, that we're actually making sure that we identify the right sorts of economic activities that will align with sort of our natural assets, but also not be an issue when sort of investors from overseas are investing in Australian stocks. So it's not, my understanding is that there's no intention for it to be completely different from other taxonomies. They want that interoperability, but there are some really unique factors that we need to consider in Australia that are important, and so it's just about making sure that within our own context we're doing what's best for us, but also what fits in with the rest of the world.
Look, I'd agree with that. I sit on the advisory committee for ASFI, and one, you've got a localised taxonomy, to your point. The second is that we will go into a heavily regulated climate economy. Compulsory disclosure is a heartbeat away. And to be able to do that appropriately, you need to be able to speak and create a language that speaks to your own specific circumstance. The EU taxonomy is very good, but there is still debate across industry whether it's the right taxonomy to lift from, or whether the South African taxonomy is more appropriate, or multiple other taxonomies across the world. And I think the importance of ASFI generating the taxonomy work, and I think the win ultimately will be that government adopts that taxonomy and that it becomes a co-created taxonomy that can then underpin the legislative and regulatory environment of this country.
Well, as I say, that's all we've got time for. So I really would like you to join with me with a very hearty round of applause for our very kind guests, for Tanya, for Kylie and for Emma.